Perfect. Then diving on into it, thank you so much for joining us for the next of our summer workshop series. Today, we're going to be discussing why your Constitution matters. My name is Chris Watts, and I'm a coordinator with our Student Orgs and Leadership team based out of the Tempe office. And diving right on into it, we're going to be covering a few different items today. We're going to be starting off by talking about what exactly is the purpose of a constitution to your organization, important things you should remember to cover in your constitution. If we're talking about constitutions, we also need to talk about bylaws and the role they play. And then finally, the biggest mistakes, the do's and don'ts of writing your constitution. All right. So diving right on into it, let's talk about what exactly is the purpose of a constitution. When it comes to your organization, constitutions provide insight and history of your organization. A lot of times they're seen as kind of the end-all be-all of your organization, but it's important to keep in mind that it is still a living document. And so with that idea in mind, your constitution serves many purposes. First, it serves to define your organization. The Constitution usually will open with a statement regarding what exactly is the purpose of your organization. And this is important. It provides some direction, it provides some insight when you are creating goals for your organization, or perhaps deciding if this is still, in fact, the purpose and direction you are planning to go. In that same sense, the Constitution serves to define important roles. Who's the president of your organization? What tasks and duties are they responsible for? Who's a part of your organization? Do some have the ability to vote and others not so much? What exactly do those positions and everything look like? Finally, the Constitution serves as a basis to create common understanding, and therefore it can often serve a role in mitigating conflict. A thorough constitution is going to lay out the processes for everything, including removing and replacing officers. It's just a way to make sure everybody's following this. And all of this circles back to the idea of basic practices. Your constitution lays out these basic practices. Do you follow Robert's Rules of Order in a meeting? Or is there a specific voting practice you utilize? How do you decide who the advisor is for your organization? All of this can be important to your constitution. So what exactly should your constitution address? Well, your constitution should always start with the purpose and name of your organization. How do you define yourselves, and what exactly are you meant to achieve? It's also important that your constitution covers elections. And this is more than just, we hold a vote every April. Take it to the next level. Who can be involved in the voting? How do they get notified of the candidates? How much notification do they get? Are people informed of who the candidates are a week in advance? Are they notified via writing about when the elections are occurring? All of these details. How do they cast their vote? Is it raising their hand during a meeting, or is it a secret ballot or a Google form? Additionally, and we'll come to this again later, but percentage of votes needed to be in favor or against. We'll talk about quorum in a little bit, but the idea of to receive a win, to be considered approved to win in an election, for example, is it a simple majority, or do you need 2/3 or some other number that makes sense for your organization? Additionally, a constitution should cover meetings. What practices do you follow? How often do you meet? Who leads these meetings? Who takes minutes, and where can those minutes be found? Consider all these details when you're addressing your meeting within the Constitution. You also want to keep in mind eligibility. Can anyone join? And is there a difference between active members or maybe associate members? Is an active member, for the purposes of our student organizations, a student, whereas maybe an associate member who may not have a vote would be an alumni, staff, or faculty member who's there to provide additional insight maybe. You also want to keep in mind the duties of your officers. This is important to lay out specific steps. Don't just say your president runs the meetings, because there's a lot to that. Are they the chair? Are they responsible for creating the agenda for the meeting, sharing it with the group in advance, taking comments and corrections to the minutes, reserving space for the meeting. Lay out the specifics of the duties of your officers. And keeping that in mind, it's maybe important to lay out who's responsible for re-registering your organization. Since we're talking about officers, another important factor of that is the idea of removing officers. What is the process to remove officers? Who initiates it? Who oversees this? What are the grounds for removal? And we strongly encourage you make these specific. For example, they've missed 2 meetings this semester, as opposed to something that may be a little more subjective. They're a bad president. Well, how do you define a bad president? Make things that can be easily defined here. You also want to make sure you lay out what the process is, what the timeline is for resolving this, and if there's any sort of appeals process involved, who gets a voice, that sort of thing. The other important thing to keep in mind, and this plays into our next item as well, filling vacancies, a lot of organizations will state something along the lines of the president will, but they don't then define what happens if it's the president being removed or the president's position being filled. So if you are going to define things that way, make sure you address both sides of that coin. Speaking of filling vacancies, again, same thing, you need to address the process. Is there voting involved? Is it an appointment? What is the timeline for filling vacancies? Is there any sort of any sort of a process where the executive board kind of reviews it and votes, or is it just the president appointing it? Lay out these details. Another important item when it comes to your constitution is the idea of quorum. This is the percentage of voting members that must be present at a vote in order for the decisions made by that vote to be considered legitimate. For example, if you have an 8-board executive board and only 2 of them are present at a meeting, it's difficult to be able to claim that they represent the feelings of the entire executive board. A common practice is typically to say 70% of whatever voting body rounded up. This can be your executive board as well, but you want to define these sort of things in your constitution. For example, if your executive board is 6 people, that 70% quorum would mean 5 would have to be present for any votes in order for it to count. If the board was 8 people, you would need 6 because 70% of 8 is 5.6 people, and you can't have 0.6 of a person, so you would round up to 6. Finally, the other important item for a constitution is you really need to address how amendments occur. As I mentioned earlier, this is a living document. Things change and your organization changes. As such, you need a space and a process for your constitution to change, and you should define what that is in the constitution. A common practice is that you typically need a 2/3 majority vote of voting members where quorum is present for an improvement to be accepted, and it typically has to have been presented to the group beforehand. Maybe it was mentioned and shown in the meeting before, and now you're voting on it after people have had time to consider and think it through a little further. Overall, it's important to keep in mind that this should be a process, and it should not just be as simple as saying, okay, we're changing it, because the Constitution takes a lot of thought. It is your history, it is your purpose, it is your goal, and so it shouldn't be able to change just at the flip of a hat. This is something that typically takes some time and some effort. So that brings us, however, to the other term that comes up a lot when talking about constitutions: bylaws. Bylaws are another governing set of governing documents that are meant to work in tandem with your constitution to define the organization. They serve to define current practices of things that may change a bit more readily. For example, maybe your constitution states that you meet twice a month, whereas your bylaws state that you meet on the 2nd and 4th Tuesdays of the month at 7 p.m. in a specific place. Since the room and time may change a bit more often depending on availability, this part of the document is often easier to change. Maybe it just takes a simple majority to change the bylaws, or maybe just the executive board to change the bylaws. Because of this, you should still define who is involved in the process for changing these and still use it as a document to keep things in line and keep everyone on task. All right. So finally, this is going to bring us to our top 10 do's and don'ts of constitutional writing. And I will note some of these are going to be general and some of these will be ASU specific. So keep that in mind. First of all, you do not want to contradict yourself in your constitution. Statements should not oppose one another or cancel one another out. This can happen because, as we noted, it is a living document and things change. Maybe you change how you define things or use terminology or titles, but you need to make sure that the document throughout itself is consistent. So make sure you address that. With ASU's organizations, our constitutions for your organizations are public information on Sun Devil Sync. Other people can pull those up. So you do not want to put private information. And what I mean by that is you don't want to put social media passwords or bank account information, for example, on these documents. It's not a good place to have those. Additionally, you want to make sure there is some consistency throughout, both the names within your constitution, your bylaws, and even on Sun Devil Sync, maybe your preamble. This becomes very important if your organization finds itself changing its name for any reason. It's very common that maybe the big sections, like the title of your constitution, the name will change, but where you have that name tucked away in the second sentence of Section 2 of Article 3, you miss it. So just being careful to make sure there is some consistency there. Additionally, make sure you define things. We talked earlier about what quorum is. Make sure you're stating what exactly that means for your organization. Are active members different from just general members or associate members? What are the roles? You also want to cover the idea of one person having too much power. In particular, not every sentence should end with the statement, "at the discretion of the president." Even if this is meant to give you some generalized flexibility to cover situations you may not foresee, I've seen it written where this was provided quite often, and it basically gave the president to decide who could and could not be members and just randomly decide that somebody could no longer be a member of the executive board. So you really do need to be careful with that. Additionally, ex officio members should not be making decisions for the organization. They are typically non-voting members. The advisors to your organization are often ex officio members. Obviously, there may be some exceptions to this depending on how your organization is set up, but make sure you define that in the Constitution so it's understood why they have that power. If they are an ex officio member, they can be involved in the process, but they should not be the ones making the decision. Again, we come back to this idea also of granting overarching yet undefined power. The president should not be able to ban a member just because they dislike them. So make sure you're defining things and defining roles and terms. With clarification, you want to offer details, not flexibility. For example, going back to our reasons for removing an officer, maybe you say an officer can be removed for missing 3 meetings in a semester, but you don't say they can be removed because they're a bad officer. What does it mean to be a bad officer? So ensure that you are clarifying things. And then finally, coming to some that are a little more ASU specific, we do require that you sign your constitution. This means that you have the names typed in, and realistically, this is just you and your officers acknowledging that this is the document you are currently operating from. Finally, ASU does have 2 very specific statements we require appear in your constitution. We have a non-discrimination statement that must appear, and this statement, I always like to clarify, if you see it in writing, the very end of it is in parentheses. You need the entire thing to be approved. And we also have a membership statement that talks about being involved in at least one semester, a student involved in at least one semester hour. So make sure you include those.